It's been roughly 2 months since The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom released, and it has taken the world by storm. Link's latest adventure in Hyrule has been widely praised by both fans and critics alike. But, after 2 months, was the hype for this game actually deserved, or are we already starting to see Tears of the Kingdom age poorly? I've had precisely 0 people ask me for my opinion on this game, but this is the internet, so I'm going to give it anyway. Before I fully discuss my thoughts on the game, I went ahead and created a rubric with which I'm going to be judging this and all future games that I'm going to be reviewing. So if you want to learn about that and how I'm going to be judging this game, keep going, but otherwise skip to the time on your screen that's presented now. In order to properly review this and all future games, I went ahead and made this rubric that I will display on the screen now. The idea is to make sure that I'm assessing each game on as close to a level playing field as possible, and as objectively as I can. Of course, no review of a game can ever really be fully objective, so my opinions are going to inform not just this review, but even the rubric itself in terms of its weightings and what I deemed important enough to include and to not include. As I go through these topics, please keep in mind that the examples I will be talking about are not all that can or will ever be considered in these categories, and are just a small subset. Since, of course, the world of gaming is vast. Our first topic is gameplay. Gameplay is the most heavily weighted topic on this rubric, having a weighting double that of the other 2 categories. I felt that this was necessary based on the fact that, personally, gameplay is the most important part of any game, and should, in fact, be the most polished part of any video game experience. In this category, I'll be looking at the things that make the game, well, the game. Story, combat, exploration, the overall gameplay loop, characters, etc. Basically, this section will talk about how I felt about the gameplay experience. So it, of course, is going to be quite subjective in terms of because, of course, this is my opinion. Shocking, I know. The next topic I want to talk about is graphics and frame rate. Now, graphics and frame rate are also 2 important parts of the game, since the way a game looks and the way a game feels, of course, play a major role on the way a game is received. What I'm really looking for in this category is not whether a game runs at 4K, 120 FPS constantly, but instead, this category is going to be measured in the context of the hardware a game is running on. So for example, a game running at 720p on the PlayStation 5 is going to receive a lower score in this category than even the same game running at 720p on the Nintendo Switch. This is because the PS5 is, of course, a far more powerful console, so I think it's reasonable to expect games released on it to be at a higher graphical fidelity than on the Switch, which is running on hardware from 2015. Obviously, I'm not Digital Foundry, so the way that the game looks is going to be based on my eyes, and possibly a Digital Foundry video or 2 if the game's been tested on there. Next up is frame rate. Frame rate, of course, is a lot easier to assess from a purely visual perspective. Again, this area is going to be judged in the context of the console a game's running on, because I'm more interested in the extent to which a game's performing the best it can on the available hardware, rather than an arbitrary frame rate like 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. However, stability of those frame rates is also quite important, since an unstable frame rate, in my experience, can be quite jarring and hinder enjoyment of a game. And to an extent, the stability of a frame rate can be even more important than the quantity of the frames being pushed to the screen. For example, a game running at a frame rate between 40 and 60 frames per second at 1080p is going to score lower than a game running at a stable 30 frames per second at 1080p, because while 30 FPS is, of course, slower, your reactions and inputs will be consistent across the board, and there isn't going to be that noticeable frame difference that the game that's running between 40 and 60 FPS is showing. Finally, we have the matter of price. Price, of course, is also quite important in a video game, because a game can have great gameplay, great graphics, great frame rates, but still be priced too high because the game's either too short, it lacks content, or both. The higher priced the game is, the higher expectations I'm going to have for it. So please keep that in mind. For example, a $30 game that scored 4s across the board is going to get a better score in price than an $80 game that also scored 4s across the board, assuming they are in the same overall genre. It's not that those games are bad, in any sense of the word, but one clearly gives more bang for your buck than the other, and this category is meant to reflect that. Now, with that in mind, let's begin my review of The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Once again, spoiler warning. Let's start with combat and enemies. And in a word, Tears of the Kingdom's combat and enemies are superb. The combat system Breath of the Wild introduced makes a overall full return and is expanded upon with one of Link's new abilities, Fuse, making combat in this game feel new and fun, even to players who came from Breath of the Wild. Being able to fuse any item in your inventory to an arrow creates a whole world of possibilities that really weren't there in Breath of the Wild, or at this point any other game that I've played before. It's the same story for weapons and shields. The items that we used to collect in Breath of the Wild solely to sell at shops now have a greater purpose. To be fused to Link's weapons and used to slay his enemies, or do unspeakable things to Koroks, depending on your persuasion. With mechanics like bullet time, flurry rush, and parry also making a return, it seems the goal of the devs was to improve upon their success in Breath of the Wild, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Overall, despite the enemies from Breath of the Wild getting reused in Tears of the Kingdom, the game does a good job at making them feel new again. For the most part, giving updated enemy designs and giving the monsters more personality than they had in Breath of the Wild. Bokoblins, for example, can now be found following a boss Bokoblin, and sometimes carry items in a sort of backpack for Link to steal if he feels so inclined. The Yiga clan now feel more fleshed out as villains, especially Master Koga, who feels more like a proper villain plotting down in the depths, rather than someone Link caught off guard who had to rush together a defense against him, like he did in Breath of the Wild. All while maintaining the goofiness that made him a good character, despite it all in Breath of the Wild. Master Koga's fights in Tears of the Kingdom build on each other and give us a sense of potential calamity. See what I did there? While still being relatively lighthearted and low pressure. Some of my favorite moments in this game came during the Yiga clan side adventures, and I really hope to see them return in a future entry in the franchise. The lower-ranked foot soldiers and blade masters also break out into the realm, promoted to instigators of chaos and kidnapping rather than being unnamed travelers on the sides of the road that Link might interact with more than once, possibly. Nintendo also added the Yiga clan outfit for Link to acquire around the world, which makes exploration that much more exciting. I only actually found out about this set by accident while exploring the Great Plateau and finding the house the ghost of King Rome used to live in, and then hunted for the remaining set since it was far cheaper than the overpriced Sheikah set in Kakariko Village. Again, in this instance, Tears of the Kingdom walks along the same path of Breath of the Wild, but really takes Breath of the Wild's characters and expands them and adds more depth to them. It takes them a lot further than the previous game did. It also adds new enemies to the world, which is a very welcome change of pace from Breath of the Wild, where we were really stuck with Bokoblins, Moblins, and Zalfos, with the occasional boss enemy like Talos, Lynels, and Hinox. It's a very welcome change of pace, and the enemies, some are either entirely new, albeit not always brand new to the series, like Horriblins and Gleeoks, or new spins on enemies like those boss Bokoblins. Overall, the new enemy selection is very welcome, and in future games I hope Nintendo is able to expand on it. Either keep adding new enemies for us to fight, or reviving old favorites. Exploration, as well, while we're on that topic, is a major part of the gameplay in Tears of the Kingdom, just like it was in Breath of the Wild. And I'm happy to report that despite this game sharing its Hyrule with Breath of the Wild, the exploration doesn't feel like an overpriced DLC, but in fact it goes a long way to making the world feel new again. The overworld in Tears of the Kingdom feels familiar, but new enough that exploring it doesn't feel like a chore, but instead like visiting somewhere you went long ago and finding all the changes, kind of like returning to the house you grew up in or something. All around the world are new caves and wells for the player to explore, creating a sense of excitement about every new location that Breath of the Wild was able to create, while still being separate and distinct from Breath of the Wild. It's an exploration, it's an excitement in its own right. Additionally, Tears of the Kingdom also has 2 new areas for players to explore, the depths and the sky. I'll start with the depths since it's the area that's the fastest to talk about. I suspect that this is an area that you either love or you hate, and I loved it. The depths provides a creepy atmosphere that really enhances the overall gameplay experience while still being open world. You can also find weapons that haven't been tainted by the gloom here, so it's worth exploring. The other thing that makes this area worth exploring are all those ancient mines you'll find. At these you can exchange Zonite, the game's new ore material, for things like energy upgrades and charges to power your Zonai devices. More of those later. Which makes traversal and exploration a lot easier. You can also find schema stones that give you schematics for new Zonai devices you can use if you want to. Personally, I did not make much use of these, but they were nice to have if only as a basis for your own designs, which you can save using the auto-build ability found in the depths. Now, the auto-build ability was probably my favorite ability in Tears of the Kingdom, because of course it allowed me to save my designs, and just use Zonite to make up whatever resources I didn't have. It was very nice to be able to just pull out an old design that I'd used and saved, and have it built right in front of me. It was a great addition, a great idea from Nintendo and the Zelda team. As for the sky, it's great. The shrine puzzles that get found up here are some of my favorites in the game and really give a player the chance to exercise in their creativity in how they go about solving them. More so than any other shrine type in my experience. I also really liked the various boss fights found up here, as well as the various 2 spheres that you can find and explore. I thought those were really cool design. Overall, Tears of the Kingdom expands on the world of Hyrule that we found in Breath of the Wild in a way that really makes the world its own. It's both iterative, building with the overworld building on what Breath of the Wild had established, and innovative at the same time, adding the skies and the depths. As for the other 3 abilities that Link had, those being Ultra Hand, Ascend, and Recall, I found them to be either iterative in Breath of the Wild or kind of inconsistent. Ultra Hand functions very much the same way that Magnesis did in Breath of the Wild, but it allows for more player experimentation with what can be picked up, as well as allowing players to stick things together to create larger structures. It's really Ultra Hand that makes a lot of the fun in Tears of the Kingdom possible, and the game would be overall far less immersive without it, because of course it's what allows you to build all those fancy Zonai devices and your own creations. Recall was an ability that I really had to warm up to, because I really didn't like it at first compared to Stasis. I only really used Recall in shrines, and whenever I crash-landed with my flying machines and needed to get them back. I found it to be a little bit restrictive in terms of where I could point it, being unable to move the camera around, therefore losing a bunch of those flying machines that I really shouldn't have had to lose. But once I got used to that and worked around that limitation, I found it to be actually quite good. The really big disappointment for me in terms of Link's abilities was Ascend. Ascend is an ability with a lot of potential. I think it could have been expanded upon a lot more. But I found that even the game's shrines didn't really make use of it. And I also found it to be very inconsistent with what it allowed me to use it on. So I had to spend a lot of time getting Ascend to allow me to, ascend, where I don't think I should have had to. When it worked, it was great. It would let me get out of caves really quickly or climb to the top of monster platforms really quickly, which is great when you're having to fight a battle talus. But when it didn't work, it was frustrating and basically just made me teleport to the nearest shrine, because I didn't want to deal with it. So I really think that was an ability that needed more playtesting and a little bit more consistency. But on the subject of shrines, they're back, and there's a lot of them. 152 to be exact, and I did every single one of them. If you like the shrines in Breath of the Wild, you'll love these too. Overall, the concept of the shrines is still the same. Small, bite-sized puzzles that end with what is essentially a heart piece from the pre-Breath of the Wild games. I found the shrines in this game to be either the same or a little bit better compared to Breath of the Wild. I found the puzzles to have a far stronger emphasis on concepts rather than pure physics-based applications. For example, there's a shrine that requires you to hit a ball towards a target, given a spike, and a sort of bat that's been controlled by a switch. And you're expected to figure out that you can use the spike to extend the area of the bat, and then time the swing properly to hit the target. I thought that was a very good design, and something that took me a very long time to figure out, but when I did get it, it was very satisfying. The shrines also completely crush the idea of multiple solutions for the most part, which is something Breath of the Wild did very well, too. Even the training ground shrines do a good job of teaching you a bit about the various game mechanics to give you ideas to apply and experiment with in the overworld, which is an area that Breath of the Wild really struggled with, especially with its test of strength shrines, which are more about just killing a guardian rather than letting you really experiment and take risks with the training grounds shrines. The one thing I will say is that it felt like the Blessing Shrines were more common in Tears of the Kingdom than they were in Breath of the Wild. But the ways to get to those Blessing Shrines were far, far more interesting most of the time, so I suppose it balances out. Again, in this case, Tears of the Kingdom really only iterates on Breath of the Wild, kind of taking that concept of a shrine and making it more conceptual rather than application-based. And in this case, there's nothing wrong with that. The Zonai devices that the game gives you are a very welcome addition to the game. The amount of development time spent in these devices must have been massive, and it shows. These devices can manipulate the world around them, move bridges across lakes, and just about anything else you can imagine. The amount of freedom that these devices allow, in particular the fans, the planes, the rockets, and the wheels, allow the player to have a freedom that's really unlike anything I've encountered before in a non-modded video game. But the closest point of comparison I really have being Redstone in Minecraft. These devices, combined with auto-build, really go a long way towards making Tears of the Kingdom its own distinct experience. And I think without them, the game would feel a lot different, maybe closer to Breath of the Wild. Even the soundtrack works well in this game. While a lot of the audio is reused from Breath of the Wild, which is fine given that it's a direct sequel, the new tracks they added ramp up in all the right places and really make it feel like a Zelda game of old again. The overworld soundtrack is reused from Breath of the Wild, and while I was originally hesitant about that, I realized that wide open world like we have in Tears of the Kingdom, an epic overworld theme like we had in the Zelda games of old, it would have gone repetitive and quite annoying, so I'm glad it was kept. As for the music ramping up, the boss fight music with, particular Colgera, best, that's great. The final boss fight with Ganondorf, great. Really great. It just ramps up in all the right places and really makes you feel like it's a Zelda game. However, where this game really needed to succeed for me was the dungeons and the story. And when it comes to those, this game didn't just meet my expectations. It blew them out of the water. The story of Tears of the Kingdoms is an actual story that takes place in an open world. I remember a couple of years ago, before I started this channel, playing through The Witcher 3 and seeing how it handles its story, and I thought to myself, this is how I want Breath of the Wild 2 to handle its story. And it appears Nintendo, for the most part, agreed with me. Just like in Breath of the Wild, you're not required to begin the story right away, and can really ignore it if you want to, so you can go exploring. But if and when you choose to experience the story, it's worth it. The only caveat I have here is that you can find Zelda before dealing with all of the regional phenomena, which kind of takes a bit of the suspense and mystery out of those quests. So one piece of advice I'd give to somebody who hasn't played it yet is to not do the Tears of the Dragon until you're starting the quest for Minoru. the Fifth Sage, since I think that would place that quest in the right spot overall in terms of the game. That having been said, the story takes the storytelling style of old, where you start off with some inciting incident, you have to go do some dungeons, you come back, you have to you reach what is kind of the halfway point, you go off and do another few dungeons, and you come back, and once you do maybe a little bit more, and then you can go fight the final boss. That's back, supplemented with the memory-based storytelling from Breath of the Wild, and that overall makes the experience richer. And I think with that, if you actually did Tears of the Dragon in the right place, it makes this like a 5 out of 5 story. It really does. But that's not even the best part of this game. Where it truly succeeded for me was the dungeons. And I do mean dungeons and not divine beasts. Dungeons. There are 6 total dungeons in the game, 5 of which are completely new, and the 6th one being Hyrule Castle, getting a brand new twist, and if you want to count the depths part, a new area. Each temple has its own themes, its own puzzles, its own personality. You have everything from the Wind Temple, a boat floating in the sky, to the Fire Temple, an underground abandoned city, to the Spirit Temple, which has Link trying to get there through building a construct at the construct factory for Mineru's use. The puzzles in these dungeons feel like actual puzzles from the Zelda game of old, while preserving the sort of choose-your-own-solution style of Breath of the Wild. It's a perfect marriage of old and new that I hope Nintendo preserves in their new formula in future titles. There's even a difficulty level unique to each dungeon, with, in my experience, the Wind Temple being the easiest and the Thunder Temple being the hardest. The Spirit Temple was a fun, experimental type of dungeon that tested your ability to problem solve, giving some tools, but also allowed you to bypass the puzzles entirely if you build the right Zonai machine. I was initially very worried about this game based on my experience with Breath of the Wild. I thought it was going to be another game in that same sort of vein. And it is, but all of my issues are fixed. The minute I landed on that Wind Temple, my fears were gone. And it felt so good to be back in a proper dungeon after Breath of the Wild. That said, all of that praise, it's not all great. Nintendo once again did not provide the player with a way to repair weapons, which is very frustrating since I feel like that should have been included. It would really allow me to be more immersed in the game if I didn't have to be almost constantly scouring for new weapons. There is a way for you to remove your fused materials and essentially carry them over to new weapons, but that's just not the same. The other issue I really noticed during my playthrough was that even 75% of the way through the main story, I was still desperate for Zonai charges and other raw materials, which really artificially raised the difficulty level in a way I don't think was needed. I think in a future patch, Nintendo should really increase the drop rate of those items, and while it didn't impede me too much, it was a great source of frustration during my playthrough. With all of that being said, I think I'm ready to give a score for gameplay. I'm aware that there's probably a couple areas or a couple entire aspects that I didn't fully talk about or even touch on, so you can let me know in the comments. But overall, the gameplay of Tears of the Kingdom is excellent. From a gameplay perspective, it isn't just a great game, it's a great Zelda game. I therefore, despite the relatively minor aforementioned issues, score this category as a 5 out of 5. With all the various gameplay elements, new areas, and especially the Zonai devices, you'd think this game would run the way that I do, which is to say, it doesn't run at all. Especially given that Breath of the Wild struggles in quite a few places, most notably the Korok Forest. However, I'm happy to report that in my entire playthrough, I noticed exactly one drop on my V1 Switch, which would be the console most likely to have those sorts of drops. I was actually pleasantly surprised at how well the game actually ran compared to Breath of the Wild, maintaining a solid 30 frames per second outside of that one frame drop. put it another way, if there were frame drops, they weren't all that noticeable, and the aforementioned noticeable drop was on version 0.0 of the game on release day. And the game's only gotten more optimized through patches since then, so I doubt you'll experience any noticeable frame drops in a casual playthrough. While in the future, I would like to see a remaster of Tears of the Kingdom run at least 60 frames per second on future hardware, the fact that it runs at such a stable 30 frames per second on the Switch is no small feat, and really goes to show just how much optimization Nintendo and, well, let's be honest here, Monolith Soft did for this game. That year-long delay was very much worth it. As for graphical fidelity, Tears of the Kingdom runs at 720p in handheld mode and 900p in docked mode, exactly the same as Breath of the Wild. While I played the game entirely in docked mode, I didn't notice a large difference in the way the game looked throughout my playthrough. So I think the game, for the most part, held at 900p throughout, which is very impressive. Of course, in a future remaster, I expect this game to run at a minimum of 1080p. But given that this game is once again running on what is essentially a 2015 Android tablet, I'm okay with 900p maximum. After all, the art style this game and Breath of the Wild has makes up for a lot of the raw graphical fidelity sins, and I suspect will age quite well in the next few years, more so than it already has. Once again, I'm ready to give this game a rating. While the frame rate is steady, I know that other games on the Switch that look just as good graphically run at 60 frames per second. However, they don't share the same scope that Tears of the Kingdom does. They're not as big of games. So for the hardware and the scope of the game, a stable 30 frames per second is about what could be reasonably expected from the Switch, in my opinion. Graphically, it's the same story. Yes, there are games that run at 1080p on the Switch. Heck, there are games that run at 1080p 60 FPS on the Switch. But none of them share the same scope as Tears of the Kingdom. So 720p in handheld and 900p in docked is once again about what can be reasonably expected from the hardware. Therefore, I once again give Tears of the Kingdom a 5 out of 5 for its incredible optimization and relatively good graphical fidelity. The development team truly pushed the hardware to its limits for this game, and it shows. Final category before we get to overall conclusions is price. This game is great. It is. And there's a lot of game, but it comes at a price, and that price is $90 Canadian. It's a lot of money. Exactly the same fact that Sony and Microsoft are charging for their next-gen games. But this isn't the next-gen game. So, for $90, is the game worth the high point of entry? I think that depends on what you care about. If you care about gameplay the most, or are a fan of the Zelda series like I am, then it is a steal of a deal for everything that you can do. And even if you're just an RPG fan, getting into something and getting a Switch and getting into Zelda for the first time, it's more than worth the entry fee. I therefore score it a 5 out of 5 in price, despite the higher entry fee. Although in the future, I expect a remaster of Tears of the Kingdom to be sold at this price as well. Which leads me to my conclusions. Overall, this game is a textbook example of what a sequel should be. Tears of the Kingdom pays homage to its Breath of the Wild lineage, while still being its own thing, bringing back elements from older Zelda games to make itself into an experience both new and old fans of the franchise will enjoy. While some of the more annoying elements of Breath of the Wild remain, such as the inability to repair weapons, these are small issues that will only really annoy a small percentage of the player base, and weren't enough for me to justify dropping its scores. I said at the start of my review that Tears of the Kingdom needed to be a good Zelda game, as well as a good game overall, and I'm pleased to say that it accomplishes that. It's not just a good Zelda game, it's a great Zelda game, and it's right now the best 3D Zelda in my opinion. I know that's a bold claim to make, but I truly think it is. It has the strong storytelling and dungeons that made the Zelda of old so good, with the exploration and world building that made Breath of the Wild a great game. I'm really looking forward to the next entry in the franchise, or whatever DLC Nintendo decides to make for Tears of the Kingdom. As for the game's overall score, it's 20 out of 20. Perfect. Of course, that's because the score is perfect doesn't mean the game is perfect, but it does mean that it met the highest possible standards across the board based on my rubric. Like I said, there are some issues. But, again, those did not take away enough from the experience for me to justify giving it a lower score. Thanks for watching my Tears of the Kingdom review. If you enjoyed my review, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps the channel out a lot. If you didn't, you can tell me why I'm wrong in the comments below. Other than that, thanks again for watching, and I will see you all next time. Take care.